possibly mean, and why did they give it to me? And it sort of goes like that, I think. I'll try and make this at least as enlightening as I did about biochemistry. I'm sure it does be fun. Mind if I record? Go ahead. This is a big topic, and there's a lot of complexity to it. And what we're trying to do is to get from where we are now to some other place. And it's sort of like, I don't want us to go this way. Nobody wants to cross that. It's a pretty intimidating span. So I want to make it more like this, and I want to close this door. Okay. So I want us to have a reasonably smooth crossing to get to where we're going, so that we can all arrive safe and sound at the other side of this thing. We have some specifically critical responsibilities as medics, and as soon as you open your mouth and say, "How can I help you?" the answer is going to depend on what the patient tells you that's relevant to their chief complaint. A decent physical assessment, and those two things are going to give you some logical consequences that this is what they presented with, this is what they told me, this is the response to the questions I asked them specifically about their chief complaint, so that I can discard things that are not relevant and really hone in on things that are, verify this with my physical assessment of what I hear and what I see and what I'm palpating, integrate those things together and say, I have a course of therapy. And this is going to help you make your intervention strategies make sense. And a lot of the time it's going to involve pharmacology. And as soon as you decide that you're going to use drugs out of your drug box, you go into this crazy world of, or worse, of pharmacology, okay? And pharmacology is a big topic. There's terminology. Ms. Davis was going over all these different categories of drugs and different flavors of beta-2 drugs, for example, just a few minutes ago. There's principles of how these things are packaged and dosing, how they're delivered into the body, how we give them. Okay, someone should fix whatever's buzzing, either your pacemaker or your phone or some signal that's. Let's hear what the message was. That's what I want to hear. There's going to be interactions between whatever the drug's chemistry is and your patient's chemistry. Okay, that's how they do something to us. Okay. And there's hazards of calculating doses. There's mathematical hazards for this stuff, and how we measure and how we dose. And there's ways that we handle these medications. And then there are legalities about how we can keep them secure, especially the controlled substances. Because basically you are now an arm of some agency who's got a medical director or a county EMS agency who's authorizing you to handle things that are controlled by the federal government. Okay, so it's a big pile of stuff. So let's look at early pharmacology a little bit. Between 500 and maybe the year 1400, 1450, diseases were considered to be God sent. It was an act of God. Many monastic orders, especially the Benedictine, which were founded in the year about 500 or so, considered the care of the sick as their chief work of mercy. And so much of what we thought of disease was felt to be delivered in somehow by a religious deity. The Benedictines, by the way, are the same people who were thought to bring us that wonderful Benedictine liquor. It's claimed that some Benedictine abbey in Normandy is where they originated Benedictine brandy. So whether they were right or wrong about who's responsible for diseases, they came up with a lovely way to blunt the impact of those diseases one way or the other. So that's what that looks like. Many centuries before even the Benedictine theories on the origin of diseases, however, Hippocrates theorized that there were forces other than God's that were in play. It wasn't particularly precise, but he was, he was starting to think about other chemical actions that had to do with why we got sick. We'll talk about that in a bit. He was credited as being the first person to think that diseases were caused naturally, which isn't too bad for 400 years BC. That was pretty neat. Anyone ever hear of the good humor man? No, we don't have that out here. That's what they look like. These guys that drive around in these white uniforms with a white truck, and they would sell ice cream. So it was a good humor ice cream. Doesn't ring a bell, huh? There's some guy that goes through my neighborhood all the time in some truck that it looks like one of those Tomaine wagons where you go and buy stuff for lunch that you shouldn't eat. He's driving through the neighborhood playing this little chirpy song, attracting children who will run out into the street blindly, hoping to buy a $12 popsicle or whatever they charge for these things. Anyway, these guys would come through the neighborhood, and there's always a flavor of the week. Okay, so this was the chocolate eclair one. Those are pretty good. This is a different kind of a good humor man, okay? This is where Hippocrates stepped in and said, diseases are not caused by God. They're caused by some imbalance of 4 humors that we have in the body, okay? And these were characterized as being yellow, boy, this is hard to see, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. None of these things sound very good. The only one that, the only ones that are legit are probably phlegm and blood. But this theory was related to the theory of 4 elements, earth, fire, water, and air. And that earth predominantly was represented by black bile, fire, yellow bile, water was phlegm, and air was air, and all 4 elements were present in the form of blood. And the theory that they came up with was that if there's an imbalance in these, where there's too much of one or too little of another, that the others would predominate, and that would characterize the type of person you were and the type of illnesses that you had. And so if you had certain things that were wrong with you, we would try and attend to those by blaming them on an imbalance of too much black bile, not enough yellow bile, too much of this in the blood, these sorts of things. The Hippocratic school also gave importance to the doctrines of observation and documentation. This is starting to sound a little bit more modern. You needed to see what you saw, observe your physical findings, observe what the patient was like, and then you would document it. You would record this, because it was likely that somebody might come back to you and have a similar complaint. What did we do last time? What did we see last time? So the origins of our medical records go back into the 400 BC era as well. Anyway, diseases were thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. And so what did they do? They would try to correct the imbalances. They would rebalance their humoral portfolio, try to dump the excess, if you will, of one or the other. So they thought that correcting these imbalances could be done by eating specific foods that might be designed to promote the production of one humor over another humor. They could also be bled, okay, to remove from you some of these humors. And it was a very common practice way up into the 1800s. They could be fed emetics to make them vomit, to try to rid them of some of the bile humors that they would have. Again, all trying to restore balance. Pretty imprecise. They used heat, they used cold, they used moisture, they used dryness to try to treat different imbalances, which explains things like hot plasters and cupping. I don't know if you know what cupping is. Cupping is a traditional remedy. It's not uncommon in the Asian culture, where hollow glass balls would be warmed and put on the chest, and as they would cool, the air would contract, and they would basically make a circular hickey where the mark was, where this thing was placed. Theory being that this would draw out and help you with your respiratory function. It would draw out some of the phlegm. And so this is what sort of early medicine was sort of all about, way back when. We also had what I call ancient compounding pharmacists, if you will. Medieval Muslim chemists started to develop methods of compounding drugs. Now, almost all of these things were made out of plant-based medicines. The first drugstores, if you will, were opened by Muslim pharmacists in Baghdad in 750. And by the 9th century, they had identified over 600 plants and herbs that had been described as having some medicinal purposes. Opium, okay, for pain management. Hemlock, which has sedative and antispasmodic properties. You have to be careful with this drug. Hemlock is also a poison and it kills people. Socrates was made to drink hemlock to poison himself when his teachings of logic interfered with the ancient Greek teachings of gods. And so as he started to challenge that and encourage his students to do causal logical reasoning, that put him at odds with the Greek leadership, and he was forced to poison himself by drinking hemlock. Ultimately, this causes its antispasmodic properties are because it relaxes skeletal muscle, and when you relax enough skeletal muscle, you relax your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, and you stop breathing. So it's a respiratory paralytic. Belladonna, which is the plant-based origin of the drug atropine, a big potent anticholinergic. Women would put a drop of belladonna in their eyes to dilate their pupils because they thought that it would make them more alluring. Okay. Now, if you've ever gone to the ophthalmologist and had your pupils dilated, you can't see at all. And you can't read, you know. So, and they may have, you know, they may have connected with guys that they wish they never met. You know, because they could see them. You know, may not been a good idea. Anyway, that was another. In the 1800s, we started to see the beginnings of what I call little pharma. You know, we have big pharma, this huge pharmacologic industry. We had advances in chemistry then that started to lead to larger scale production. We had plant-based versus chemical-based synthesis going on in labs. Cinchona was used as an antispasmodic. Cinchona is the origin plant-based drug for quinine, and we use quinine and its derivatives for treating things like malaria. So, and we use quinidine, which was an antiarrhythmic that was used for a very long time. So there's lots of different things. Oxygen was discovered and started to be purified in the late 1700s, around 1800. Morphine was purified from opium. So we started to get, as chemistry evolved, the ability to purify and measure and quantify how much of what these drugs are that you're taking. We got better and better at that stuff. In the 1800s, nitrous oxide was developed. Nitrous oxide was developed by a British chemist called Humphrey Davy. Okay. And Humphrey thought that nitrous oxide might actually be a cure for tuberculosis, which was widespread in the 17 and 1800s throughout the world. It was interesting because you all know what nitrous oxide is. It's laughing gas, right? This is the drug that in a high enough concentration makes you not mind your pain so much. Dentists use it sometimes. Some people use it in the field. We've had experience using it in the field as well in this county. But we have better, shorter acting opiates that we use now instead. But it's called a dissociative anesthetic because you still feel the pain, but you really don't care about it very much. You know, it's like the pain is happening over there someplace. And it's inhaled, so it's rapid onset through this large pulmonary alveolar capillary bed, and it's rapid offset. So once you take it away and you ventilate it off, it goes away pretty quickly. So there's a wide margin of safety with this agent. Anyway, what he used to do was he would have demonstration parties among his friends and some of the British royalty, and it was very popular, as you might imagine. And he had copious notes about the ability of gas to completely take away the sensation of pain. And he recommended that it would be employed as an anesthetic for minor surgical procedures. That recommendation was ignored by the scientific community. However, it was incredibly popular and it became the highlight of contemporary social gatherings. So it's no surprise that even though it didn't cure tuberculosis, but they didn't seem to care whether they were coughing or not, it didn't catch on as an anesthetic right away. it caught on more as an entertainment device. And soon thereafter, he became Sir Humphrey Davy. So apparently the British royalty must have enjoyed his gatherings as well, because they knighted him. Okay, so these are sort of the starts of small drug companies. Then we had Big Pharma, okay? This is a long way from 750 AD Baghdad. It's a $250 billion a year business. There are over 100,000 over-the-counter, not prescription, just over-the-counter drug products out there on the shelves. So you started with this, and now you're over here, okay? And then there's all the non-regulated homeopathic things that you'll find on the shelves of this spore and this agent that's supposed to help fix whatever the ailment is that they're geared to fix. So this is a big deal. The non-regulated vitamins, these bone and joint supplements, various skin preparations, of which there are, aisles and aisles of this stuff. Where did these things come from? What's the origin of these drugs anyway? Well, they could be animal, vegetable, mineral, or we could synthesize them in the lab. Let's talk about animal, because it really gives you a sense of how we learn from observation about what's around us. Here's a quick physiology review for us, okay? When your blood volume falls and your blood flow to the kidneys is reduced, anybody know what happens? Somebody said something.
Secrete renin?
Louder.
Secrete renin?
We secrete renin, okay. And what does renin do?
Starts the angiotensin cycle, which eventually...
Right, so it takes angiotensinogen and converts it to angiotensin 1, which is then converted to angiotensin 2, which is an unbelievably powerful vasoconstrictor, okay? And so we're constantly sensing renal flow and modulating how much renin we're putting out to convert these precursors into potent vasoconstrictors to maintain our blood pressure. Okay, so if you're lying down and you stand up abruptly and your blood pressure falls this much, your kidneys say, gotta raise that blood pressure. And so we do, and we increase vasoconstriction by this activation of the chemical pathway. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. It turns out that in the 70s, banana plantation workers that were bitten by the Brazilian arrowhead viper had a precipitous fall in their blood pressure, and these guys would fall out of the trees and get badly injured or worse. And they couldn't figure out what is going on up here. And these guys are harvesting bananas, they get bitten by this arrowhead viper, and the next thing you know, they're down. And it turns out that the venom is a very powerful blood pressure lowering agent, okay? It inhibits the key enzyme that converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, which means there's no vasoconstriction, which means you vasodilate because there's nothing to maintain your vascular tone. So these guys get bitten, chemistry is disrupted, they can't convert into their normal vasoconstrictive blood pressure supporting chemical mediators, and they passively vasodilate, and their blood pressure falls and they faint. This is a good idea. The pharmacology people look at this and say, can we purify that stuff because we could use it to lower blood pressure? And they did, and this was the first one of these angiotensin conversion inhibiting drugs that was ever created. It's called captopril. Okay, it's the oldest one. That's where it came from. So as we started to look around us and ask questions, we started to understand ways that we could take something, modify it, use it, purify it, and then incorporate it into our medical pharmacologic armamentarium. If you look at the vegetative side, I mentioned it earlier, we're able to purify morphine from unripened opium seed pods, and so we were able to define the drug, purify it, figure out how many milligrams it would take, and start understanding this amount generally gives this amount of pain relief for most people. Some need more, some need less. It's a pretty subjective thing. In 1829, the anti-inflammatory agent salicin was isolated from the bark of a willow tree. Salicin is aspirin, salicylic acid. So we start where people would chew on bark for pain relief. We're now able to isolate the specific substance and develop aspirin. from mineral side, we've been able to figure out how to isolate things like calcium and what it does in muscle, so we can give calcium agents, calcium blocking agents, those sorts of things. And then we synthesize things. We synthesize insulin. We synthesize synthetic narcotics. We synthesize antibiotics. Okay, not necessarily naturally occurring ones. We've now figured out ways to purify them and make them in the lab. We'll talk about how that works a little bit later. We synthesize thyroid hormone. So there's all these different players in the pharmacology arena. So let's move away from the origin of these drugs, from animal, vegetable, mineral stuff, and from the developmental stages from early pharmacology into more modern pharmacology, and see how we got there. So here's a little bit more into the modern era. Let's talk about smallpox. Smallpox is a disease that we don't see anymore, that we don't ever want to see anymore. It's a disease that only has humans as its host. The only known stores, known stores, are the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and in a laboratory in Russia. Okay. You may recall we were terrified that somebody was going to release smallpox vaccine into the population when the war started in Iraq, and that was part of the preparation for biological warfare, was to revaccinate all of the troops who were going to be involved over there with smallpox vaccine. Here's the story of the vaccine. There's a disease called cowpox, okay? It's a disease that is a livestock disease. It manifests itself in the form of red blisters and pustules, and it's transmitted by the touch of infected animals to humans. So in rural communities in Europe and elsewhere, milkmaids who were milking cows that had some of these sores on the cow's udders would develop these lesions on their hands. And it caused a very mild illness. It's not that big of a deal. Everybody seemed to get it. So it's very similar in appearance, but much milder than the smallpox disease. Now it turns out that Edward Jenner had a farm, and his gardener had a son called James Fitz. And what Jenner did on May 14th in 1796 was he took some of the material from one of the cowpox sores from his milkmaid Sarah's hen, and he took some of this stuff and he scratched it into James Fitz's hand. Sure enough, James comes down with a mild case of cowpox. And this was the first time somebody generated the theory and proved it, that you could actually transmit cowpox from person to person. Everybody thought this is a disease you get from the cow. Okay, it's a mild illness, and wasn't that interesting? You not only get it from the cow, but if I have it and I get some of my contaminated material on maybe an open area of your skin, you're going to get it too. So he proved that that could happen. Okay. So a few days later, he gets mildly ill, James does, with cowpox, but he was done in a week. He was fine, he was well. Okay. So Jenner now knows that cowpox can be transmitted not only from a cow to a person, but between people. Okay. Big hairy deal. Okay. Then he gets this stroke of genius that says, boy, cowpox sores look a whole lot like smallpox. Really a lot. And reportedly, farmers and people who work regularly with cattle who had had cowpox seemed to be spared from getting smallpox. So he said, not only do these sores of cowpox look like the sores of smallpox, but if you've got cowpox, you tend not to get smallpox. Everybody else is getting smallpox. It's a bad disease. It's highly fatal. So he says, I wonder if having had cowpox would protect against smallpox. So he goes over to young James again and says, yo, lend me your arm, okay? And what he does on the 1st of July of that year is he takes some of the smallpox virus from a sore of somebody who has smallpox, and he scratches it into James. He's basically giving him a highly communicable, pretty often lethal disease. He says, here, let's see what you got. And as Jenner anticipated, and undoubtedly to his relief and that of the gardener, his father, and most other people around, James didn't get smallpox. Either on this occasion or on many other subsequent occasions when his immunity was tested again and again and again. Okay? So, we now knew that there was a cowpox protectivity against smallpox. When we got smallpox vaccine, that we got when we were kids, that most of you didn't, and some of you may have if you were in the military, a decade ago or so. What they gave you was a purified form of cowpox, okay, because it cross-reacts with smallpox. So that's what you get, okay. So that's the vaccine. The cowpox germ is called vaccinia, so that's where the term vaccination came from. Okay. The smallpox germ is variola. Okay, so you get vaccinated against variola because of this cross protectivity. Not the way we like to do science these days, but that's how it happened. If we fast forward another 150 years, 130 years or so, we have an even more modern era. Now we're in the 1920s. And in February of 1928, Alexander Fleming was a microbiologist. He was a Scottish biologist. And he had spent the First World War in battle hospitals in France, okay, in battlefield hospitals. And fortunately for the planet, he survived the war. He returned to London to study ways to treat various types of wound infections that he saw so often in trench warfare in the First World War. One time he returned home from a summer holiday, and his former lab assistant, the guy who used to work for him, a fellow by the name of Merlin Price, drops in for a visit. Okay? And Fleming takes this opportunity to gripe to him about how hard his work is now that Merlin has left him alone in his lab. And while picking up one particular petri dish that was growing colonies of staph germ on it, he shows this to Price, and as he looks at it, he says, this is really weird, because there's a whole patch over here where the staph colonies are not growing. I don't get it. You know, all the other places, they were loaded with this stuff, but there's something about this one that they're not there. And it turns out while Fleming was away on his holiday, some mold had grown on that dish. And there was something about that mold that seemed to have killed off the staph germ in that area where the mold was colonizing the dish. And so the question is, what is this mold? So Fleming spent several weeks trying to grow more mold and try to figure out what is in this stuff that seems to inhibit the growth of the staph germ. So he was able to reproduce this over and over again. He just couldn't figure out what was going on. So he discussed this mold with a mycologist. These are people who study molds and fungus. A friend of his, who had his office right downstairs of Fleming's. Okay? And they determined this mold was a penicillium species of mold, a known species of mold. So he decided to call this active substance that the penicillium was producing and killing off the staph, he called it penicillin. Okay? That's where it came from. Where did this mold come from? It probably wafted upstairs from the other guy's fungus lab, who was growing all kinds of this stuff. So the spores went upstairs, some land on this plate, they start to reproduce, they release this substance that inhibits bacterial growth, and suddenly we've got our first antibiotic. Okay? Now, Fleming ran lots of experiments on this stuff to figure out the effect of this mold on other bacteria, and you might imagine no bacteria had ever seen an antibiotic in the history of the planet before. So penicillin was good for all kinds of stuff. okay? And he saw this great potential. He said, this is terrific. But he wasn't a chemist. He was a microbiologist. So he couldn't really isolate the active ingredient that he had called penicillin. He didn't know how to figure out what it was. He just knew that this mold kills germs, okay? He couldn't keep the active components of it around long enough to figure out what they were. Certainly not long enough to be isolated and used in people. But in 1929, he wrote a paper on all of his findings, and he published the paper, and no one cared. He garnered no interest whatsoever at all. 12 years later, in 1940, which was the second year of World War II in Europe, two scientists at Oxford were researching projects in biochemistry and bacteriology that might be enhanced by the advances in chemistry. So an Australian by the name of Howard Florey and a German refugee by the name of Ernst Chain, who were chemists, were able to extract what the chemistry was of penicillin and define it and purify it. And by the end of the war, we were using it, okay? So all three of these guys wound up with a Nobel Prize for this collaborative work. So it just shows you how some of these things happen by accident, some of them happen by intent, some of them are, we observed this, we intended to do this, we thought we would see this, and we tested it, we purified it, and now we have it, okay? We have federal regulations about drugs that we need to be aware of as well now. The game plan is we have to protect consumers against false claims, bad side effects, something like that. And we have to standardize some of the manufacturing processes so that if I make something and I call it ibuprofen, and you make something and you call it ibuprofen, it's ibuprofen. Okay, it's the same stuff. Around the time of the Spanish-American War over Cuban independence from Spain, this was about almost 1900, opium addiction was a big problem in the civilian population in the continental United States. And so we wound up with things like the Harrison Narcotic Act, which regulated and taxed the production and the distribution of opiates, the controlled substances. And then it led to a series of all kinds of other legislation that regulates how we use some of these medicines. So the Pure Food Act in 1906 required labeling of foods and dating them and these sorts of things, but the Harrison Narcotics Act was a big one. This started the controlled substances. Then we had modifications of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Acts of 1938, 52, and 62. Now we have to label the side effects of medicines. We have to note their addiction potential if they have it. And we need to be able to have special prescriptions for dangerous medications, okay? So now we have to have controlled substances. The Narcotic Control Act of 1956 put out penalties for possession of heroin. It outlawed marijuana. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 identified narcotics and other medications that had high abuse potential, and it classified prescription drugs according to 5 schedules, okay? And I'll show you what these are because you're going to be using some of them, okay? We'll start from the bottom, okay? Schedule 5 are the most innocent of the controlled substances. They're cough medications. Maybe a cough medication that might have a little bit of codeine or something in it to try to suppress the cough. Schedule 4 have a higher potential for abuse, but it's very limited. Things like phenobarbital, Valium, benzodiazepines. So we can't use things like midazolam, Ativan, any of those drugs without them being registered as controlled substances. So these have to be prescribed with a DEA license on them, okay, a Drug Enforcement Agency license. Schedule 3 this is where we put all the Vicodin, our commonly used prescription pain medicine, Norco, Vicodin, things like this, that we take at home. Schedule 2